Welcome, everyone. My name is Brett, and this is another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. We have Gregg Henriques returning for another visit after 5 episodes of his new series with John, which I've been very much enjoying. And thank you so much for being here, Gregg.
It's really nice to be here, Brett. Thanks so much for inviting me.
You've been here before, and I think you told everybody about yourself, but maybe you could give maybe a brief introduction again, just for those who aren't as familiar with you.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a professor of psychology at James Madison University. I think, the snapshot of my story is that when I was in graduate school in the mid-1990s, I was getting trained as a clinician. I was, into being a psychological scientist, and then I was learning how to be a clinician. And something happened in the mid-1990s where I realized, wait a minute, there are all these different languages in psychology. And when you actually move into the clinic room, you have to decide, well, what paradigm or model or orientation are you going to use? And I thought they all had really interesting things to say, but I was like, well, why do you have to choose between them? Then I went back to psychology and asked, with that new lens on, well, what is psychology? And then I realized in the 1990s that nobody knows what the F psychology is. And so that was an awakening to me, and that started my own meaning crisis, as it was. If I was going to be a psychologist, I wanted to know what it was. I fell down a rabbit hole of sorts, first with evolutionary psychology, which was an emerging discipline, kind of looking at the human mind through an evolutionary lens. And then I made a left turn into my own work and ultimately first stumbled on the tree of knowledge, which was a new schematic for thinking about, like a term called big history, sort of the big view of the universe, and this maps it in a different way. And then that led me to flesh that out and ultimately develop what became a unified framework. And so I've been working on that in theory, and I've been teaching people how to do psychotherapy and clinical psychology. I've been a director of program, but then I stopped doing that so I could devote more time to scholarship. And then over the last 2 years, I've sort of found a little bit of frustration with the blue church of the academy and jumped off into these alternative communities like Rebel Wisdom and metamodernism and the Stoa. And of course, John's work I see very much as connected to that.
Right. So you've described your work as building a more unified meta-psychology. So what is a meta-psychology?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I wouldn't have used that term a while ago. I owe Zach Stein a nod. So Zach Stein was on the Stoa talking about a meta-psychology for anybody who was watching it. So meta means beyond or above or stepping outside of. So you can have like metacognition, which is really cognition about cognition. So meta-psychology is when you take a step back and really position yourself from a particular kind of philosophical position or worldview, or it's a complicated term is metaphysics. You might have heard of that term. Metaphysics refers to sort of the core first principles of philosophy, the concepts and categories used to divide up reality. So meta-psychology, yes, I am basically saying we have to go back to first principles of understanding to make certain kinds of claims. And then I locate myself in the first principles of the tree of knowledge system. Behind me, by the way, is a theory of knowledge in the garden. Yes, those are a lot of different kinds of metaphor references, the Bible and things like that. But the tree of knowledge is a kind of metaphysics for science, meaning that it's a way of thinking of natural science as a scientific worldview. And then it uses that scientific worldview to delineate what would be a coherent science of psychology.
So the tree of knowledge, and I listened to in the first episode of your new series with John, which I want to come to in a second. You go through that in detail. Now that seems very useful for a cognitive psychologist and for academics. Is there a use for the layperson of the tree of knowledge? How can we use it to help look at the world and psychology in a
Sure.
different sense?
Yeah, no, that's And it absolutely, yes. My own journey was so that I could be a psychotherapist, so that I could help people learn how they get trapped into particular maladaptive patterns that then increase suffering and frustration that is so easy in this day and age to find oneself in. And then how do you reverse those maladaptive patterns? Which means you need to gain insight and awareness of what's going on. You need to learn how to accept various things. You need to learn pathways to effective change. How to do that, it's really tricky. I work with a lot of people, work myself, how to do that. It's not easy. But that's the pragmatics of it, is how do you cultivate more valued states of being and living. So the question, though, is that we have all these different psychologies, and they do tell us different things, but they don't go super well together. But yeah, there's a big chunk of the system. The overarching system is this garden, and it really is about cultivating knowledge and practices toward valued states of being. So how do we understand that for everyday life? I can certainly give you a couple of examples. Like for one of the key insights that I had actually right before the Tree of Knowledge was I now call it justification systems theory. Okay, so justification, that's what it means is about the way in which your language system and self-conscious system works. Okay, so as a human, I like to say we humans are both primates and people. And what I mean by that is that we are primates in the sense that, of course, we're great apes. Okay. A person is as adults, we become people, and a person is an entity that is self-conscious and takes responsibility for its actions on a social stage and can give accounts for why we do what we do. I like to point out that although empirically the only persons we've ever encountered are human beings, science fiction gives us access to lots of different ways to think about persons that are not human beings, like Jabba the Hutt. Okay, he's a person in that meaning, but of course not a human being. So we're both primates. That's the grounding of our being is in our primate nature, and then the culture person level of existence, which makes us. Oh, I see my dog right behind me. My dog lives at the mental animal level of existence. Okay, which is akin to our primate self. But because my dog doesn't have access to justification, language-based reasoning, and the history of cultural evolution, we can't socialize my dog to become a person. Okay? But my kids, because they have access to language, they did. They got socialized. It starts about 18 months. They start picking it up, and they start climbing up the ladder of socialization. And what they do is they learn what's justifiable in this culture person plane. That's the process of socialization. Okay? Now, why is that relevant? Well, what it means is that you have a part of your mind, a narrating part to yourself and others, that's always engaged in a process of justification. Okay? And that's then interacting with other parts of your mind. Since we're on John Vervaeke's system, we can then quickly connect it. I'm sure people here, well, for folks who have followed him, know he talks a lot about the 4 P's of knowledge, right? So you have procedural knowledge. In some ways, that's the most basic form of knowledge in terms of interacting in a very scripted way with the environment. You learn how to tie your shoes in a procedural way, okay? He then talks about perspectival knowledge. That's the knowledge from behind your eyes when you open up and you see the world a particular way. He then talks about participatory knowledge. That's you as an agent in dynamic relationship, really that agent-arena relationship that he talks so much about. Now, as primates, those are all knowledge systems we share with other great apes and other mammals. Okay? What we have that other great apes don't have is propositional knowledge. Systems theory really is a theory about the functional organization of that propositional knowing system.
So, and now you and John have started on this project to wrestle with the simple task of explaining consciousness.
Yeah.
So, how did this project come about? And so, how did it come about? What is it about? And where is it going?
Yeah, well, that's so. John and I are really, I believe, I really like to think this is kindred spirits. So John, he comes from a philosophy background, but then he dives into cognitive science. And he's concerned with the fragmentation between philosophy and psychology, and builds really an integrative model, or seeking an integrative model of cognitive science and philosophy, what he calls capital C cognitive science. Well, that's very, very similar to my own journey. Although I was located in psychotherapy and the science of psychology, the tensions and relations between those two systems are very similar in many regards. And I think we both basically stumbled on, or not even stumbled on, got really sucked into the same basic problem. I actually have a term for this. I call it the enlightenment gap. Okay. Enlightenment gap refers to, so the Enlightenment is when Galileo and Newton, they built, physical science. Okay. And then you also have like people like Immanuel Kant, a famous philosopher, and Hegel. There's some major philosophers who gave us a philosophy and a science. Okay. But what happened in that time is they never really solved a way to think seriously about, or coherently about, the science of psychology. And really, what is the scientific account of the mind or of consciousness? The gap is that in their grammar and knowledge systems, and this is most famously represented by René Descartes, and this is why John and I focus a lot on, he in particular, he's a very knowledgeable about René Descartes, who created as his philosophy, trying to make sense out of the world, ended up with a mind-matter dualism, okay, where he thought Cartesian dualism is a frame that says, hey, there must be these two separate worlds. There's a world of matter, and it's physical extension stuff. It bounces around, it moves in mechanical ways. And then there's this world of mind, which must be a different kind of thing because it behaves so differently and it has so many different qualities. I'll put it quickly like that. But it turns out that really, for good philosophical reasons, that kind of dualism, almost no one nowadays in philosophy or science really supports that dualism. But there hasn't really been a way to effectively solve the bridge between philosophy and science on what is consciousness in the material world. Okay? That's the mind-body problem, is that there's no agreed upon way of talking about it. And so we're both interested in that. And John had built a model of integrated cognitive science, as I'm sure folks have heard him talk about, relevance realization. Relevance realization is a model for how the nervous system works all the way down. That is, that it's picking up what is relevant to realize, okay, ways of solving problems so that you gain affordances toward, so that the animal can move in its direction as a complex adaptive system. Okay? So John then realized, he hooked together some brilliant ideas about cognitive science and saw that this moved you from a model of neurocognition, in other words, the mind as an information processing system, and also could trail that both into intelligence, like how does the information processing system get better and better at solving problems? And he argued that that system also helps explain the features of consciousness. Okay, and it is, in my opinion, it's a very, very brilliant set of insights. Okay? Now, what I was doing on the other side of the equation here is I was developing a coherent map of mind overall. Okay, and boxing mind in both from the bottom, like from a behavioral view, and from the top, like this view of justification. And that narrows you into the domain of consciousness, which is, when I use the term consciousness, when John and I tend to use it, we are talking about that first-person experience of phenomenology behind your eyes, okay, that no one else can see other than you. And we're each trapped behind our eyes at the level of phenomenology, or at the level of experiential consciousness, okay? I had boxed that in by focusing on how, from the bottom, the nervous system works as a behavioral investment system. And from the top, by top, I mean, in this case, human, and human person, it also operates as a system of justification. Okay? And then in between is this neurocognitive process that somehow gives rise to phenomenology. Well, that's the puzzle piece that John was working on. Okay. So then when I listened, what happened was I was listening to John talk about his meaning crisis. And then I was reading his stuff, and I was like, John, how far are you taking this? Because I think you have a real key insight with the relevance realization and this distinction that he makes between what he calls adjectival qualia and adverbial qualia. I can tell you what he means by that. When I heard him make that distinction, it was very important to me. And I knew the combination of relevance realization and that distinction was key. So I said, John, you're clearly onto something really big here in this. This is what I call mind 2, by the way. Mind 1 is your behavioral mind, and mind 3 is your talking mind. Mind 2 is your feeling mind, into perceiving mind. And then he was like, well, Gregg, actually, I'm giving this course to my students over the summer. And you're welcome to tag along and just watch the video after, I didn't join the actual class, so that every Tuesday I'd pop in, and then after he would send me the link, and the next day after the class, I'd watch the class. So I then, basically took his class as an adjunct, and then watched him share it as a seminar, and then was chiming in with him with questions and with, I think a complementary analysis from where I was. And I think as we started that process of discussion, it dawned on us both that we really did have very complementary views, that I could help showcase what his view is and vice versa. And so then we were, took the bold step, and he was like, I'm going to do a series on this. I want to do a series on this with you. And I was like, sure, man, I love talking to you. We end up talking, might as well tape it and put it up, right? And I also really love the idea that we're really embarking on a different kind of academic exercise with this project. It's all part of the Dialogos, only this is now a specialized academic Dialogos, as it were, because it's two of us tackling a project. And I'd much rather be doing this than trying to get publications and peer review. It's just a lot more fun and easy and engaging and accessible, I think, to other people. So to me, it's a really beautiful thing. As far as what it affords. So at least that's my vantage.
And we certainly benefit more from it than trying to find papers in journals. So thank you for that.
Right. Now you got a high level of just, because you have to then learn the very technical language and go in there. You got to battle peer review, whoever the gatekeepers are and all that area. Believe me, I dealt with, as an academic, I know that reality.
So David Chalmers talks about the hard problem of consciousness, which is just the how do we have, and you talked a bit about it in the series, how do we have a conscious experience at all? How does inert matter go from inert to having a conscious experience? And so he talked about the hard problem and the easy problem. Are you and John focusing on the easy problems, or and the easy problems aren't that easy? It's just, but
no, that's correct.
or do you have a hope of solving the hard problem as well?
Right, that's a great question.
Maybe you could just explain for the audience also the difference between the easy and the hard.
Okay.
In a much
there is some controversy about this, but I like this. I like Chalmers' comments here. So, and actually that's woven into my whole conception of mind 1, 2, and 3 also. So let me see if I can explain it to you in relationship to what he means by the easy problems can be really defined in terms of neurocognitive functionalism, okay? And explaining behavior through neurocognitive functionalism, all right? So let me imagine, let's imagine we were like the Borg. You guys remember the Borg from Star Trek, okay? And let's imagine those guys don't have any consciousness. They're just robots, okay? And let's imagine they came, and I'm looking over here at my fish, right? So my fish are swimming around, and when I go up and I feed them, they get all excited. They have interesting herding behaviors. They'll have startle responses. Actually, fish can learn quite a bit, okay? So if the Borg could study the fish, right, they would go in there and they would just have their algorithms for looking at the relationship between the inputs, okay, and the outputs, and then they would basically just see, and I mean that in quotes because we're talking about a Borg that's a robot, just an input-output function, and see the nervous system as a bunch of wiring. Okay. And then they could pretty much, the argument is they could almost essentially, from the third person experience, explain everything through this perspective. Okay. And then, but maybe, what if the fish actually have an inner experience like we do? Okay. Like, what if the fish are conscious in some way, but the Borg aren't? The Borg would never have any idea to look for that. They would never ever find it, and it would be completely blind to this other piece of reality. Okay, the fish's experience. All right. Now I use the fish because it's an example also that says we don't really know how much experience fish have. Okay? There's a big, in 2009, there was a special issue, the Journal of Fishery, where you had experts, some claiming fish have pretty elaborate conscious experiences, some claiming that they are basically like robots. They of course respond to stimuli, but may have no conscious experience of even pleasure or pain. That's a big debate. Okay, I think the leaning now is that they probably do. That's certainly where I lean, but we don't know. I certainly don't know if a housefly has any conscious experience or not. Okay? So one of the big problems of mind two, what I call it, that's that inner experience. Okay, so mind one is the idea that the nervous system is this information processing system, and it regulates behavior, and that's the easy problem. And we know that that's where, and the argument certainly that I would have is that's where it comes from, okay? Meaning that nature builds these nervous systems that have initially reflexes. A reflex doesn't have any consciousness the way I would mean the term in it, okay? And then you build on top of that layers upon layers, and then it's in that hierarchy, and then in the brain, and then the layering of the brain at some level. And I've got lots of books on this, and there's lots of debate, okay? I've got my model that I'm really tracking other people who are experts in this more than I at this particular part of it. So then you get the argument really is that what happens in consciousness is the guess is that there's an intersection between three different domains. In the exterior senses are then referenced to an interior sense, and then there's an affective evaluation of pleasure or pain. And probably the base of our consciousness is the intersection of those three things, the base of animal consciousness. But we don't know, okay? And it's very hard to know for two reasons that make it very hard. I actually argue the hard problem has two sides to it, okay? And so one is I'm going to use a technical word, I'll define it here, the epistemological problem, okay? Epistemology and philosophy, that's like, how do you know, right? And then the other's the ontological problem, which is your idea about, well, what is real and what's your theory about what is real, okay? So the epistemological problem is the problem that you can never see somebody else's direct consciousness. It doesn't matter whether it's even a person, or a dog or a fish or anybody. Your sensory system is contained completely. So all your experiences flow through the tunnel or the spotlight or the theater of your experience, and you can never not have something outside of that or see directly somebody else's, okay? Maybe when you were a kid, you were like, well, how do I know that the green I experience is the green you experience, right? And then you can talk about it and you can kind of compare, but actually you can never directly know, okay? That's called what I call the epistemological gap, which is the just fundamentally important distinction between the view of the world that's a third-person view from the outside and the view of the world as first person. Okay? The real concrete difference between the two is like you can film the third-person view. Okay? So we can take a film of a third-person view. You can never film somebody's interior phenomenology. You can only take guesses as it. Right? Well, that's it, right. Whether we could even do it in theory, actually, is a complicated question. We can certainly do it more and more indirectly with better and better measures, like, for example, in terms of if we track brain activity and then correlate. That's still indirect. But anyway, so what can you see with a camera? Well, that's from the third person. You can never see the other vantage point directly. So that's the epistemological gap. And then the ontological gap is we really don't know. It's very complicated to be very clear about, well, how much do we actually know about how the brain generates conscious experience? And how much of it is just correlative, like we can make lots of cool correlations between brain activity and the kinds of brain's activity that seems to be associated with consciousness. Stefan Malus Dahane is one of guys who's done some unbelievably brilliant work on what he calls the cognition ignition, the conscious ignition switch, okay, and about how it's associated with particular kinds of communication between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe at about 300 milliseconds, like 1/3 of a second after you perceive something, there's an ignition. And when that happens, the conscious system lights up, and that's when people will say, yes, I see that. And before they, if it's 200 milliseconds, they don't see it. So you can make this comparison. But why that kind of brain behavior gives rise to consciousness in general, and more problematically, why on earth do specific brain behaviors give rise to specific consciousness features? Like, in other words, why does this activity give rise to greenness, but this activity gives rise to the smell of a rose? There's just no idea about what kind of brain-based mechanisms would generate first-person experience and why. There just is no. So that's the ontological problem. It's a theory about. So we can show that it does and correlates, but the mechanism, the explanatory mechanism of the reality of why that brain activity gives rise to first-person experience, and then you flip that around and say, well, yeah, go ahead and build something that feels. It's like, yeah, no, we don't know how to do that at all. So the epistemological problem is you can't see it. You can only see it indirectly. That's the epistemological gap. The ontological problem is we really don't know the mechanism. So that's the hard problem. And John and I are not fully solving the hard problem. We are boxing the hard problem in. That's really our goal, and narrowing it down and getting our language correct around it. And that's a big deal. So there's a lot that we're doing cognitively, psychologically, and language problem. We would have to hook up, in my opinion, with the brain-based people. Carl Friston's doing great work, and Dahane I mentioned, and other people. And ultimately, we need the psychological, cognitive science, and neuroscience views really coming together, and some more other advances to really solve the problem. But we're making progress chipping it in. We're certainly grappling with it, and we are untangling key parts of it, in my opinion.
So I'll just ask one more question before I get to questions from the viewers. And just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, just cue it up in event text. Just let me know you have a question, or write it out if you want me to read it out. So I've always been interested in the idea of consciousness and talking about it, and the hard problem, this easy problems, and just thinking about it. But I can't say, it was sort of an interesting problem. It was, it warps the brain, or, it hurts the brain, but it's just, it's fun to talk about. But what you and John were saying in that first episode of your series, it seemed to be that it's not just an interesting problem. We almost have a duty, if we want to be, even as a lay person, that we almost have a duty to investigate and to think about this question in reference to our own meaning generation, and possibly our own meaning crisis. First, am I correctly formulating that? And,
yeah.
and why is it more than just an interesting problem for lay people to talk about, but it's almost key to solving their own meaning problems?
Right. I do believe a duty. That might be a little strong. But I want people to. Here's my. I believe that we're facing an enormous number of. I'll put it this way, and then I'll come back to that. Okay. I look at what modern science has been able to accomplish at the level of material control. Okay, and I am awestruck at it. Okay. And we've been unbelievably able to solve a wide variety of different material control problems. In fact, I'm a fan of Daniel Schmachtenberger, who said we've been so unbelievably successful that we're basically turning everything into a paperclip. He uses this analogy, and basically a consumeristic system that now channels money into control and then builds material things. Okay? So we are about as much in material control as we can possibly be, And I would argue we're about as mentally sick as we've been ever. Okay? Why is that? So, that, and the reason, in my opinion, is because we are running on operating systems of understanding, okay, that relate to what our souls are, what our relationships are, okay, what nourishes us, but fundamentally what our nature is, that are completely, they're potentially misguided, they're distracting, they're fundamentally structured in a way that I believe basically instead of nourishing the soul, we deplete it. We say there is no such thing. And, I'm not making a supernatural claim here, but what I am saying is that there are ways to talk about psychology, the social sciences, the humanities, and theology, and on a number of different things. We have so much potential to nourish us. And I believe that basically the STEM system got unbelievably dominant, and STEM stops at neuroscience. Okay, STEM meaning the sciences, technology, engineering, okay, math. Those things stop, and the reason is because the Enlightenment did give us a relatively coherent way to think about those domains, and then the rest of it is, sorry, excuse my French, a shit show. Okay, of coherence, and so that's the academic problem. My feedback to everybody is be aware. The knowledge system, the academics, the experts, the whatever, nobody knows what they're talking about. Okay, and I'm being a little facetious here, but there's no consensus of understanding. That should really, really give us enormous amount of concern when we start. So when we hear things like, so everybody was ready to buy a bill of goods that, depression is a chemical imbalance. Why were we so ready to buy that bullshit? Because we didn't understand the relationship between diseases and disorders of the brain, of behavior, of emotions, of context. We were just like, oh my God, I feel like crap. And a lot of people feel like crap. And Big Pharma says that there's a disease out there. So take a pill. That's what your doctor says. Well, that's a big, I'm not saying you should never take a pill. I'm just saying the entire thought system is corrupted. Okay? And that has huge implications for a wide variety of different everyday lives. And so, yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big deal in how we think about ourselves. It's a big deal in our relationships. It's a big deal on virtually everything that we do. So that's why I think John and I see it as so unbelievably crucial.
And so as a lay person, when it comes to the question of consciousness, what questions should we be asking ourselves as lay people? We're the average lay person isn't going to go into the same level that you and John do, obviously, but on what level should we be looking at it?
Well, there are a couple of different things. So, my hope is that John and I, one of the big challenges and one of the things that I'm a real critic of my discipline for, what I want to do is I want to hand people easy things that then they can turn into and use with some utility and generalizability. Okay. So, for example, I have my mind 1, 2, 3. Okay. And then I want to give that people so then they can start to apply it. So you have your body habit system, the system that's really not conscious, system that's really guides your behavior. That's mind 1, right? You have your behind the eyes, your perspective, and participatory engagement. Well, that's mind 2, consciousness. At least the perspective is behind the eyes, okay? And then mind 3, that's talking to other people, right? And now do you say, what is the relationship between how I talk to other people and myself? How do I feel and see in the world through my perceptions? And what do I do? Okay, well, that's doing, feeling, thinking, and relating. Great. Now we actually have, those are concrete terms. All right. So how do I think and feel with my vision and perceptions? Okay. How do I talk, reason, and then how do I justify to other people? Okay. I want to be able to hand people, that's actually a common folk psychological set of languages that actually, if you line them up and show how they all interrelate, well, yeah, now that's a decent map. And then you can understand why you're doing, you're feeling, you're thinking, you're relating minds, or domains, they actually often have conflict. And you're like, oh God, sometimes you want to do something that you're thinking, I shouldn't do. And your wife's thinking, no, you shouldn't do it. It's like, well, what are those different conflicts? And then how do we, So I want to help folks with some better framing, and then they make it their own. in relationship to each of our lives behind our own eyes as our own unique experience of the world. And you're each of us and each of you are all. Science is not about your unique experience of being. You are, and it's about making your life your unique. That's the humanist in me, and I firmly believe that. And it's about cultivating that unique baton of existence that each of us have.
Well said. So Mark has a question for you.
Hello, Greg. It's nice to see you here. I'm glad you're back, and I'm glad you're familiar with John's stuff, and that you're in the psychological realm, we'll say, although I personally despise psychology for a bunch of reasons. We might agree on some of those reasons.
Amen.
So in John's model, right, he's got the 4 P's of knowing, and like we have some modifications we're trying to propose for that at some point that John isn't particularly fond of, we'll say. But one of the things I think we're all struggling with, at least from my perspective, and maybe John or you and John have worked this out, I don't know, is how do emotions and emotional states relate to the types of knowing? Because my conception is that all of that is about perspective, and what we've done is actually moved perspective sort of below the types of knowing. And then so like if you think that emotions are like an external force that sort of drives and shapes and changes the types of knowing, then maybe it's beneath. I don't like the Cartesian system, but like it's the best I have, right? And so if that's like something that a driver from underneath that feeds in, or if it's a projection from the top, or how that might interact and what that interaction might look like, that would be great to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. Right. So John's in cognitive science. All right. And one of the problems with cognitive science for those of us that are in psychology is it's cognitive. Okay. What do you mean by cognitive? And where does cognitive fit in relationship to, say, I don't know, important terms like motivation and emotion? Okay? I'm a clinician. So that orients me deeply to emotion. And so, so I'll give you my basic frame in relationship to this. I was just talking a little bit about it. All right. So for me, the perspectival knowing certainly gets pulled in so that the organism, the animal in particular, all right, is developing a map of where it is relative to where it's sensing it to be to create a position, and that creates the screen of awareness of cognizing. Okay, but then right after that, and really in dynamic tension relationship to this, okay, is the energizing implication of what that screen is all about. And I'll say that again, the energizing implication. So as we determine what is, you are activating appraisals immediately about what ought to be. Those appraisals then are the ground of your affect system. That's why you have an affect system that's organized into 2 broad domains. You have a positive affect system and a negative affect system. That's also on an axis of passivity or activity. And you have a motivational affective system that's either high arousal, low arousal, positive, negative. If you create a grid, you get what's called the circumplex model of affect. Okay? So high arousal positive is desire. Right? Low arousal positive is contentment. High arousal negative is fear. Low arousal negative is depression. And what you basically get in that system is what you're getting is the emotion that then is energizing the system, right, in response to what it's realizing to be relevant. All right. So John's focused on relevance realization. I'm focused, remember, on the path of behavioral investment. And it's the energizing motivational system, i.e. the emotion, that's then mediating that relation. And of course, feeding back, which is then as you get emotionally activated, all right, you then feed back on how you then shift to determine what is relevant. When you're feeling shitty versus when you're feeling elated, you pick up on different elements in the environment. So there's always an iterative feedback. In fact, I have what's called the P, which is perception, relative to M, which is motivation, that then generates an emotional response. Okay. So there's that constant dialectic tension between what you're perceiving to be what is, what you want to be, either to avoid or to approach, and then you get an emotional, energizing reaction based on that appraisal. And that actually creates what's called a control feedback loop that regulates the participatory knowing. John and I will be talking about that, I think, going forward. And yeah, my point is that basically what I will do is I will add pleasure and pain at its root, and then the positive and negative affect systems, and they will connect to the relevance realizing appraisal system to then actually guide the behavioral investment pattern. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I think the only thing missing out of all of that is, we'll say, your current emotional state and how that interacts. So everything you described, I think, is all about like assuming a neutral state, and right, and that seems to be where you're starting, and then you're saying, there's all this prediction that goes on, and that's great, and I believe that, and your model sounds right to me. In that case, what you explained sounds perfectly okay. But then I'm more concerned with, well, we have a base emotional state from which we're starting, not a neutral emotional state, and so that skews everything, including relevance realization. So that's what really comes right down to it, right? Is that,
Right.
well, people find something relevant because we'll say, I don't know, they're looking through a certain lens, which is like the most reprehensible thing in the world, right? And so, what do you have to say about that base state? Because that's where
Sure.
this is where that idea of, is this on top of the types of knowing or on bottom, or in this case, maybe it's both, right?
It would be, yeah, for me, it's definitely both, but you're absolutely right. So the fundamental intersection, I mentioned this, which I do believe will be the screen of consciousness, is going to be an exterior sensation intersecting with an interior sensation. Exterior meaning, what is the judgment of my place in the environment, and then what is my bodily state? Okay, that's where you're going to then get into what's your mood state and higher level. So bodily state is, am I hungry? What's my bodily position? What am I actually seeking? What are my needs? That's what the interior system is doing. Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Am I sexual? And then for higher order, am I feeling? This is why we always talk about mood as a clinician. What's the mood is the climate of the system. Is it in a manic mood? Is it in an anxious mood? Is it in a depressed mood? That's the idling state that the system is in, not the emotional immediate reaction, which is sort of like the weather of the day. But the climate is, what is the climate of the organization? And certainly, like, for example, as somebody who's an expert in depression, I will show when somebody gets into a shutdown mood, it shifts the entire lens structure. You may see the world through rose-colored glasses. Now you see them through gray or black-colored glasses. And the reason fundamentally is because that motivational affective shift reorients the lens, if you want to use that term. And then there's a feedback loop. Right? So then the feedback loop happens at a level of perception, the perspectival and participatory knowing, like, are you engaged in a particular way? And then my mentor was Beck, who focused on cognitive psychotherapy, and that gets into the justifying system. So then the justifying system is a pessimistic justifying system. You get all of these complex feedback loops where you get shut down, you get oriented to see what's relevant in terms of threat, cost, and loss. Okay, so then you extract that perspectively. And then you have lowered anhedonia, which means you drop your positive affect system. You get more defenses, which you put up your negative affect system. And then you tend to justify things pessimistically and hopelessly. And all of that creates basically a cascade of behavioral shutdown, which then causes people, if you fall into a major depressive episode, this becomes a shitstorm of a nightmare. Okay? So yeah, absolutely. What the pre-motivational mood state is going to be coming up from the state of the organism. That's all your interior reception, and then into your motivational state. Your thalamus, hypothalamus, going to be working on basic issues like thirst, sex, hunger. Okay, and then higher animals are going to be looking at things like status and other kinds of positional elements that are then going to be really orienting what is the path of behavioral investment, and then what's relevant in that frame.
Okay, I think I see what you're getting at. So roughly what you're doing is dividing emotion into two types and saying mood is internal, and then the emotional state we see is, we'll call it the difference or the dissonance between the internal and the external signals, right? So
Right.
there's a prediction, and that's what explains the lensing. And then if you have a negative lens, that might go into John's reciprocal narrowing. If you have a positive lens, you might go into reciprocal opening, for example. And yeah, I think if you divide consciousness into mood, and then this predictive expected state, the difference between them is your emotional state or something. Does that sound roughly like?
Yep, yeah, definitely getting. I could get a lot more specific, but yes, that's exactly right. So emotions are generally that, and you can see this in the difference between like fear and anxiety. So anxiety often can be an anxious mood. You feel agitated. Okay. Fear, though, actually as a particular stimulus. Okay. And then you're like, oh shit, I don't want to see that. Get me the hell out of there. I see a spider, I freak out. Okay. So then you have an agitated state that you're operating in general, which then you heighten your threat detectors. And then the spider hits on your screen. You reference that and you're like, oh my God, get the hell out of there. And you pull off and you experience a jolt of fear. So it's an emotional fear reaction sitting on an anxious mood.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense to me. That was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks, Mark. Struan has a question, and I think he wants to pit you against John here. So watch out.
Fantastic.
Hi, Greg. I just wanted to say that I've really been enjoying the series between you and John, or the series of conversations, rather.
Okay.
But I'm kind of withholding judgment on the whole series until it's finished. Well, I was going to say that.
Me too.
Well, some of the things you told Mark actually it interrupted the question that I was going to ask, sort of. So I just want to give, it sounds to me very much like you want to put your yes and no with John's true and false, and so I'm going to be interested to see just how much that little glimmer bears out. But so my actual question is what's your beef with John using physicalism as opposed to naturalism? That's really been making me curious.
Okay, right. So I don't know that I have a real beef with the way in which he uses it, although I do need to talk to him. He endorsed a book on atheism that I loathed, that I want to speak with him about, to see what he liked, because that's really where the I think it was Rosenberg, I have to remember, atheism, it was something like that. Anyway, I'm blanking on it. So here's the basic issue. For me, we need to be, this actually gets back to some of the things I was talking with Brett about, okay? Physicalism smacks of physical reductionism, right? That's my concern. Meaning that what's ontologically real is matter in motion, ultimately, okay? And then if you have that root, so it's just physics and physicalism, all right? That to me is materialist flatland thinking, and that's deeply concerning. And I much prefer naturalism, which then, if you just look at the tree of knowledge, you see, yeah, matter's real, and so is life, and so is mind, and so is culture. They all have ontic validity, and you cannot reduce culture into mind into life, and life into matter. Thus, physicalism carries with connotation or denotes or all that, you use that word in different ways, but that's what it sticks on. And I prefer a naturalism. And I know John's an emergent naturalist. I mean, he's not like he's a reductive physicalist by any stretch. We would be arm wrestling all the damn time if that was the case. But I actually want to get philosophers and all of us to be like, yes, we're substance monists, okay? But physicalism carries a reductive implication that I would prefer and thus to use the word naturalism. So that's the basic issue.
Is the book the Atheist's Guide to Reality?
Yes, I think that's it.
Okay.
There's a bit in there about, right, so he tries to create the basically everything is just physics, is the way I read him. And there are a couple of quotes in there that clearly state that in ways that are just, in my estimation, ridiculous and absurd.
Yeah, well, I think I can sympathize with their views very strongly. There might even be some kind of overlap between, in the Q&A last night, I was picking John's brain about it, the norm of intelligibility, and it actually sounds like we might have common kind of ground to have, or like agreement as a common basis. So that's also intriguing.
Great.
Solid has a question I'm going to read. Greg, what do you think of Jung's work in general, and more specifically of his map of the psychic system and how it relates or not with your work?
Say that again. I missed one of the words.
what do you think of Jung's work in general, and more specifically his map of the psychic system and how it relates or doesn't relate with your work?
Yeah, definitely relates. Great question. I mean, first off, you meant Carl Jung, right? I heard that correctly. J-U-N-G?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So, this is a wonderful question. And I definitely have a mostly love but somewhat hate relationship with Jung. And this is true of the psychoanalysts in general. So I'm definitely on the science side of the equation here, okay? And grew up with that edge. And I'm also, it took me a long time to be a really good reader. So when I tried to read Carl Jung and when I was an undergrad, I was like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Okay? And because I think he is guilty of using an unbelievably over-elaborated model. Okay, so what exactly is the ego relative to the self, relative to the persona, relative to the shadow, relative to animus, anima, the collective and the personal unconscious in relation. Okay, it's like, whoa, now I add archetypes and all this, and it's like, okay, you've got a lot of variables there working around with a lot of lacking in specificity. So my language system is always like, do I understand what the word corresponds to? What's the referent? So I found him to be brilliant and unbelievably learned, but also unbelievably vague. And the depth stuff in my early years was sort of like, well, that's off the deep end. I want to be more concrete. I have become more and more appreciative of him over the years. I'm deeply appreciative of somebody like Zach Stein's appreciation for him, Jordan Peterson. So that's a general comment in relation. When you look at what he talks about, okay, in terms of the structure of the consciousness self system, there are huge elements that overlap significantly. In fact, I teach my students about, kind of like how you take so for my system, I have what's called the updated tripartite model of consciousness, okay, which models the big domains of the human consciousness system in terms of the following. One is your experiential system, that's behind your eyes, the intersection of perspectival knowing, feeling, etc. Okay. Then there's your private narrator, and then there's your public self. Okay? So we can immediately take his persona, what Jung identified as the persona, and immediately connect that to what I call your public self. And it immediately connects in relationship to what is a persona but a mask, and how does the mask relate to the demands of the social environment, and why do you want to put out here what is publicly justified so that you don't get punished in relation and lose status and get all of this other element. You have to hold, and we actually need to hold together our social mass to create constraints so that we actually can all get along, all right? And in so doing, we then need to block off certain aspects of our psyche. We have a self that we hold and an ego that regulates it. I think he saw that well. But ultimately, then the filtering gives rise to what? The shadow. Right? So what is the shadow in my system? Well, I call it the Freudian filter that pushes away. And it's basically like, it's essentially the accumulation of what you hope you aren't, but what you fear you are. Okay? And what that means is what you're trying to do is your public self-concept. You're trying to justify, well, I'm a good person. I don't deserve this punishment. I should be all right. Why shouldn't people love me more? And you fear deep down that you are a loser piece of crap who really does deserve contempt. I mean, that's what our core fear is, okay? And then we create a shadow. In fact, my dad just gave a lecture and produced a book on George Washington. He's a George Washington scholar. And I taught him about persona, ego, and shadow, really through the lens of unified theory, but I encouraged him to use Jung's work. And he's actually gone around on the lecture circuit talking about George Washington's shadow. Okay? Because George Washington had us with massive, I believe, clear evidence for massive elements for ambition, but ultimately he had to justify what he was doing in disinterested service for the country. But he does a lot of misdirection in relationship to, well, of course, I don't want any of this. And then behind the scenes is like, make sure all this happens. Okay? Because I believe he had a shadow self. So in terms of the map, essentially for me, you have a self-concept system that you carry around. The active portion of really the reality principle, use Freud's the ego justifier, trying to determine what the hell's going on. It's close to your internal narrator. You have a persona, you have a shadow that involves both a collective unconscious. I could get into what's called the influence matrix, which really is a map of the self-other archetypes that we carry around, or at least when they get stabilized. Okay, there's a collective unconscious, and then of course there's the personal unconscious, really what you fear you are, but hope you're not, and keep into the backdrop. So there is a lot of overlap with the basic mechanics with Jung. I love a lot of his depth work. I really do encourage folks to be aware of Zach Stein's, as he talks about ensoulment, and Hillman's work. And really, I think we need more of that. My scientist side starts to go, that's a little speculative. But my humanistic side says, love it, bring it on.
Next up is Manuel, who spends a lot of time on here talking about shadow. So it's fitting that he's up next. Go ahead, Manuel.
Fantastic.
Well, I can talk to you about shadow, but that wasn't where my question was on about, because my question is about something else I spend a lot of time doing here.
He spends a lot of time on a lot of stuff.
Fantastic.
I spend a lot of time trying to figure out psychotechnologies, right? Like how they work, how to improve them, right? And the thing that I ran into recently is how to evaluate the usefulness or the results or from a practice that's personal, but also from group practices.
Okay.
And I was thinking of setting up like a form or something as a way of gathering information, but then I ran into this big problem, and I posed this question yesterday to Vervaeke, and Vervaeke said, "Well, yeah, it's really hard to evaluate what the consequences of a practice are." And he basically said, well, it's just really hard, and you're probably not going to be able to do it. So I'm going to pose the same question to you and hope you get a better answer.
All righty. All right.
Yep. Yeah, I think he go ahead, Greg.
I'm not sure I heard. What the question was?
The question is, how do you gather feedback from a practice in order to improve it, right? Because the thing that we use to conceive of a lot of the practices is that they work through second order effects, right?
Yeah.
So
okay. Mm-hmm.
When you're designing a practice, right, you're trying to engender those second order effects, and we think we're doing that by creating affordances within the person, so that they can then get growth, and then you get into a big dragon that's called integration, which is also maybe something you want to talk about. But yeah, right, like how do you make a feedback loop that works in that sense?
Sure. Okay, so I think, so there's the immediacy where you would have a proximal goal or some sort of desired outcome, and then you can decide, oh, well, this thing is working because I'm getting my desired outcome. But it then has all these second order.
Oh, did we lose Greg, or am I lost?
No,
Think we
talking animatedly to us, and then he left.
Well, I guess so. Hopefully, Greg will be back soon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Great to have all of you, and
You hope reach out to him or something.
I'm gonna see if he's still. Oh, he just he said he thinks he was kicked out. So
Maybe
come back.
Hello.
Yes. Oh, are you back? Yep, you're back.
Okay, not sure what happened there, but okay. So I was just saying that. So what I'm hearing is we have to have a framework for second order effects, and ultimately we have to have some sort of evaluative framework. That's and then correct me if I'm wrong, but let me tell you how I think about this, because this is a major problem in psychotherapy, ultimately. And what I mean by that is that. One of the things I really struggle with psychotherapy is, well, how the hell do we know what is good anyway? Right? It's like, Somebody comes in, their child's died, and they're miserable. Right? Well, how depressed should this person be? Do we really want to just all of a sudden make them happier? Okay. If I told you, oh, by the way, my whole family was killed in a car accident earlier this afternoon, but I want to make sure I was here for the Discord server, you'd be like, whoa, what the hell's wrong with that guy? Right? Okay. So suffering and entanglement and the messiness of the world. Martin Luther King said there are some things we should never be adjusted to. We psychologists gave him a great word, maladjusted. He was like, there's some things you should never be adjusted to. So there has to be, in my estimate, a sort of a moral, ethical ethos container, and those provide the ultimate frames of reference for valued states of being. For me, I'll be talking about on wisdom on tomorrow at the STOA, 21st Century Version of Wisdom. My basic definition of wisdom is knowledge and practice toward valued states of being. Okay? And then the kicker is, well, what do you mean by valued states of being? That's a hell of a question. For me, I have sort of what I call my ultimate justification, which gives me a moral compass, which is B, that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. And I could dive into that a little further, but if you were going to ask me, well, how would I know whether this practice is actually good overall in terms of all the potential external contingencies, externalities, as well as the actual thing? I said, well, let's look at it within, and then let's draw increasingly concentric circles around what the good is, and we'll put it in that context. And if it solves the problem locally and it's part of the good, and this is how I then evaluate the good, well, then keep doing that.
Right. So yeah, I wanted to go in a little bit different direction, because I think I can evaluate the good for myself, which is a big statement. But the direction I was going in is effectiveness, right? Like how do we know that the thing is doing what you want it to do, and when it's doing what you want it to do, is it doing it in the right way so that it will actually affect the world afterwards, right? That's more, because it's really easy to put someone in a state, right? But it's really hard to make them learn a lesson afterwards, and the lesson is the thing that we're focused on, because that's the permanence within the impermanence.
Well, I guess to me, I mean, I'm maybe having a hard time tracking this a little bit, because I'm guessing for me, as I start to drop into, well, the specific kinds of lessons, the specific kinds of events, the specific kinds of things that you want to see learned, that will require, it depends a lot on what your goals are, or what your desired outcomes are in the short and long term, to then be able to decide that. It's also the case that obviously you're going to be constrained based on what you know, so you would never have some optimal reference point where you instantaneously would know all of the possible ways in which this could be done and know what the absolute optimal efficiency would be. That would be like you'd have a manual for maximizing optimal living across an algorithm, which is not the way it works generally, unless you're God. And so then that's, I guess, where my reference would be, is like, well, you have to, there are going to be massive limitations and constraints based on, well, how would you know that? So maybe this is why John said it was a hard question. I guess I'm not sure if I'm inside the constraints or if I'm outside. And if I'm outside, then I'd be like, yeah, I wouldn't be able to, there'd be lots of things that you would need to know. Maybe I need a more specific or concrete example.
Right. Okay. So I'll give you the dilemma that we've been navigating here, right? So Viveki introduced this new practice, philosophical companionship, right? Are you familiar with that?
I haven't heard that, actually. No. Is that fairly recent?
Yeah, that's fairly recent in his.
He calls it philosophical contemplative companionship.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So what happened is that we got a set of we got an explanation from John, and we got a reference to a book, and the book said, well, do this, this, and this, but then wasn't really clear about how to do this, and this, and then John said, do this, this, and this, and it was also not clear, and then it wasn't clear what all of these things were supposed to engender and how they were supposed to interrelate. And then we're like, okay, great, right? Like, so we can engage with that, but like, how do you figure out what you want to improve? Like, what is it even supposed to do, right? All of these things are really hard. And then, well, yeah, you necessarily have to try something, right? And then you can maybe converge on the thing, right? And the feedback was the thing I wanted to use as a method of converging, but because it's such a, well, it's basically a chaotic space that you're interacting in, right? You don't have any significant relevance realization to help you.
Well, I mean, so yeah, that's a good question. I mean, from a I'll put it in how about I put it in a psychotherapeutic term, and then at least that you move in then outside of psychotherapy, you want to perhaps just engage in lots of creative space. Maybe put some minor constraints on it. I'll use Zach's thing and say, hey, am I enhancing skill development? Am I enhancing transcendence? Am I enhancing ensoulment? Am I just being in a different way? And, that's what I mean. You can operate without constraints and be creative and just take stuff and say, hey, maybe this works. And I would certainly say sometimes that might be very appropriate. I wouldn't necessarily not want to do that. But then by definition, you aren't going to know the answer to those questions. So for me in psychotherapy, like one of the things that I struggle with, I say in psychotherapy, because some people really want a very open system. And I do this largely in my life. I want to basically be like, okay, what am I actually doing? This is what I get into. Well, what are the constraints that I'm placing on it so I know the parameters that I'm working around? So for me, then I'm going to say, well, all right, I have a basic sort of set of understandings about what my core values are, what my various areas of potentiality are, what my not necessarily pre-specified goals, but my directions for growth are. Okay. I want to then engage in practices that foster increasing awareness, that allow me expand my horizons, gain clear insight, okay? Increasing capacities to accept, to allow me to cohere and integrate, okay? And increasing capacities for adaptive growth and change so that I can upgrade my skill development, upgrade my expansion and ensoulment, upgrade my connection with transcendence. So what that then does is it provides me, then I would then say, okay, John's got a notion for a philosophical contemplative practice, all right? I'll be like, oh, well, okay, I'll put that in some sort of schema, and I'll say, well, all right, I'll look at these kinds of elements and then determine, well, if I interact with these practices in a particular way relative to all the other things I might be doing, what kinds of growth promoting changes would it be? And then ultimately my backdrop is dignity, well-being, integrity, that serves as a reference. So I think that's at least the basic schema I would bring to try to create some sort of evaluative system, iterative feedback system on whether the practice and path is useful.
Right. So John mentioned self-deception as well, a lurking predator there. Do you have something to say about that?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, so the whole point of I talk a lot about justification systems theory. It's a theory of your self-consciousness system. And it says the default is you try to justify why you and your side and your way of being is right, and why anything that's in your way or anything defined against you is wrong. That's the default. That's why we see the most common and powerful of all biases is the my side bias. Okay. And you can start with self-deception right there. So what you try to justify in particular kinds of ways, one of the great challenges then is that you do give rise to that process is central to what the process of justification is central to pushing things away that you fear you are, but hope you're not. And your job, as far as I'm concerned, as a responsible, reflective citizen, is to peel back that shadow and live with it, and be wary of the systematic biases. So for myself, I'm a pain in the ass. Like when I would go to my son's soccer ball team, and all the other parents around would be like, "Oh my God, you see that call?" And I'd be like, "Actually, that was a fair call. I don't think that was a bad call." Because immediately I'm on the other side of the team going, "Okay, I'm not going to participate in just the collective. Oh, this is our team, and we're going to bias this way." I could be annoying that way. But that's so absolutely. What am I? As a psychotherapist, it's all about, I commit more towards integrity, and integrity is soundness, honesty, honor, and truth. And often there's a tension between well-being because we want to kind of bullshit. Oh, everybody is attractive and smart and deserves a trophy. And I'm like, that's dangerous. It's very dangerous. Okay. At multiple levels. So absolutely, I've got a lot to say about self-deception. I love, when I heard about John's practice about the biases, that fits right into the way I think about self-conscious justification. It's set up to be kind of your own lawyer function, and that's got a lot of potential problems with it. I mean, you want to develop practices that undo that, and I think that ultimately you get a culture that manages the opposite of self-deception. One of the things that makes me so disheartened about our politics is that basically it's a self-deceiving game. I mean, everybody is just in there to win the game and to frame everything in relationship to their team. And it just makes me nauseated. So yeah, I definitely think we should do work to understand the way we are in honesty and integrity.
Well, thank you. You gave me a couple of frames to reevaluate your thinking.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
I think, and Mark has another question.
Hey, Greg, I want to segue off of this crazy talk here. I know Manuel's important project is very important, and I like the stuff you had to add to that. But you had a talk with Guy Sengstock not too long ago that we watched, and you two were talking about this phenomena where these high IQ people will say that guys seem to think, well, given where I am, I'm surrounded by high IQ, high achieving people, where they go through this transformation and they suddenly become like more successful or more able to get their message out or something. And then they get resentful about that, and it creates problems. And it wasn't clear from the conversation whether Guy was saying he got them to that point and then they had the second problem, when the second problem happens. But I was only interested in the first problem, like what is that? Like if you have a high IQ person and all of a sudden like they become successful, what is the transformation there? Do we think, like, how does that work? Because I see, especially on online, especially in the Discord, we'll say, but online in general, you see a lot of high IQ individuals with just ridiculous amounts of knowledge on interesting topics, and they're say unable to engage with making a success out of their knowledge, we'll say, or even communicating their really good and salient ideas to people who you would expect to be able to communicate to. So I'm looking for insight on that.
Okay. Well, yeah. No, there's a couple of things. I think that what Guy was talking about was, he gets them sort of often after that sequence has happened, although certainly it could be before. But in other words, they struggle. They struggled, and then all of a sudden maybe they find a path to success, but ultimately they carry resentment and confusion and uncertainty about sense making, about who they are, who they were before, who they were as they became who they are now, how to be who they are. And essentially the dynamics are, we all, everyone, it's not really a high IQ issue from my vantage point. We all sort of have a private sense of ourselves. We all want to be known and valued at some level. In other words, we want important other people to know us for what our potential is and to value us for that. Okay? That's a core human drive. And indeed, if I were to say one things we really want to create societies that maximize, we want to maximize this experience of relational value. Okay? What we tend to do is we maximize social instrumentality, which is sort of social influence, like how much control that people have in relation, money and status and these kinds of elements as markers of it, to move people around. And that actually is a different phenomenon, although they're yoked together. But what I mean by that is that here you have somebody, let's say, who's not recognized, okay? what they'll have is they have this gift that they want to give, and they wish they could be seen for. And then what will happen is that when it's not seen, when you're not known and valued for what your potentiality is, you'll then begin to get a dilemma of like, why? Okay, do I really have this gift, or am I actually just bullshitting myself? No, I really feel it. Then why don't they see it? And if they don't see it, and I have this longing to be seen, then what will happen is I'll get counter dependent, and I'll say, "Fuck you!" Then I don't care. Okay? And many individuals will then go off on their own and be counter dependent, talk to themselves, and develop their own particular kind of narrative, which makes them potentially socially alienating and not attuned to the general dance. Okay, so they may then be real brilliant in a particular way, but to develop a feedback loop with the social milieu and to be sensitive to it, by definition, if they become counter dependent, they no longer are caring, so they'll be very disagreeable. They won't really attend empathetically to the audience in a particular way. And also, you have to be networked into the institution, whatever institution of influence that you're in. It has to be at a place that's ready and willing for whatever those ideas are. So there has to be a zone of proximal development between your ideas to be recognized and where the institution or group of individuals is. Okay, so then you build up this point of resentment, and then if in these scenarios that we're discussing, you have individuals that then all of a sudden the zeitgeist changes and then they're recognized. Okay. Now you get pulled back in, and now all of a sudden, oh, you're this. Hey, this is really helpful. You can do all this stuff. That's going to create an inner dilemma. Okay? You have already told yourself in this scenario, and certainly not everybody's this way, but I've certainly seen it in some. You've already, once you develop a counter-dependent identity, meaning part of you are like, I've decided I don't care. Then when you get approbation and connection and all of that, you inevitably have a dilemma. Okay? You either, that if you suck it up, if you feel it and allow yourself the relational value, then you have to admit that you wanted it all along. Okay? And you have to really admit that you were deceiving yourself and you were lying yourself and you were telling yourself all that because the inconsistency is obvious. It's like, now I like it. Well, do I only like it when they like me? And then what is this thing? Okay, what is this idea that I have? Because it feels so differently when everybody else loves it, but it's still the same thing. Okay? So the bottom line is that we want to be known and valued, and we seek congruency between what we can offer and what other people see us. What we're talking about here is a person that's got a developmental history where there's significant incongruence. That incongruence generates all sorts of different kinds of psychological conflicts, and coming to terms with those is one of the developmental challenges that people that have that trajectory face.
I see. So the implication here is that basically, as a result of, we'll say, the social rejection or something, right? Mm-hmm. The equivalent of social rejection, that creates a bunch of problems that then need to be fixed. And so the question that Guy was centering around was like, what is that, and how do I deal with that? Because we have a lot of it. And then, my question would be, and your indicated answer was sort of like, who knows? The zeitgeist changes and they become popular. My question is more centered around, well, how do we get the damn zeitgeist to change? Or is there something that person can do to feel validated and sort of get whatever social feedback mechanism they need, so that at least they don't give up hope maybe until the zeitgeist changes? Or is there something they can do to make themselves heard in a world that isn't listening? We'll say is if that's something you can comment on, that would be great.
Well, yeah, I mean, my hesitance in commenting will be, as somebody does psychotherapy, then there's an enormous amount of idiographic. Well, it depends on the person, depends on the context, depends on the timing. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What kinds of edge do they have? Is it that they're coming across as kind of hyper edgy and aggressive? Well, then I'd want to tone that down. Is it that they have become too autonomous and sort of adopted an avoidant attachment style, so they completely disengage? Well, then I'd want to tone it up. At what level has sort of their narcissism created a language in themselves that then is definitely hard for other people to understand? Well, then I'd want to cultivate what's called mentalizing and empathizing. How much resentment do they have? And is that leaking out? And then I'd want to figure out ways to tone that down. And then obviously there's other issues about just, well, what's the framing? Who are the audience? How do you get people involved? Are you reaching out and making connections? The main thing that I would want to say to people, is that we do wrap ourselves up with social influence and relational value. Okay? And that it's, and that's inevitable for a very big part of your motivational emotional systems. And you will have mood reactions. Lord knows I do. Okay. But it is also the case that it's the idea. I mean, I'll speak for myself, So, I mean, I've been working on this fucking set of ideas since 1997. Okay. And they're just the ideas. And I may well die with nobody knowing anything about them. Or maybe all of a sudden somebody's going to see something, and then there's a spreading, and I connect to John, and then I connect to Daniel, and then all this other stuff, and it takes off, right? Well, the ideas are the ideas. While one contingency feeds my knowledge, my desire for relational value and social influence, fair enough. And believe me, I'd be happier that way. It's the capacity to separate out that capacity to be at peace, the capacity to understand what you're doing, whether you're doing it for the ideas or whether as a psychologist, I was fortunate enough, and the nature of my ideas were fortunate enough, so that I barely, a couple of years after this whole thing happened, I was like, well, I can't give a shit about what other people do. I have to pursue this. This is my calling. This is what I care about. If I die and nobody knows me, I'm still going to take this path. I'm not going to follow Aaron Beck and try to get into his coattails because he's all famous and do all that shit and then put this on the back burner and hope this happens so I get some influence. Like, no, this is what I am, and we'll just see what happens. But I made that commitment, and you sacrifice some in relationship to that. But you just have to, every path has its pros and cons.
So if I had to quickly summarize sort of what you said in my own language, it sounds like there's the common themes here are you need to get people to understand that, just because their ideas aren't socially accepted, they're not getting the right social signals, doesn't mean that their ideas are bad. And to have a commitment to those ideas beyond their commitment to their own ego, we'll say, which is probably the hardest piece. And then to also cultivate, to encourage people to cultivate enough empathy so that they are better communicators overall and better understanders, better able to understand. I like understanders better. I think I'll invent that word. Anyway, better able to understand in the world, where the zeitgeist is, where they fit in it, where it might be moving to, or how to move forward with their ideas and still make meaningful connections with, we'll say, existing subsystems, and that is really their best hope at success with no guarantee or something. Does that sound accurate?
That sounds very accurate. And just remember, we use another heuristic. It's called the availability heuristic. Okay, so the availability heuristic is what is in our head. And one of the things that all of us that try to develop ideas struggle with is that 90% of the people in our head are the famous people that made it, because that's how we know about them, right? So it's Newton and Einstein and all this stuff. So, and so all of the people in our head who are getting recognized, okay? And then we have our ideas to contribute, and then we compare ourselves to those individuals who we're wandering around with. And of course, the fact of the matter is that for every one of those individuals, hundreds upon hundreds of people had cool ideas that are forgotten by history. Okay? So the vast majority of people have things they want to contribute and influence the little circles they have and influence nothing else. That is the destiny of the vast majority of us. It has to be. There's only so much attentional space in the world. Okay? So what I see, certainly what happened to me, is I would make comparisons with individuals that were completely unreasonable. Okay, in relation. I mean, I have my grandiose fantasies as to why. But the fact of the matter is that, I have lived and been, like the vast majority of people, a no-name, and that's the vast majority of people. And it's about being okay with your local garden and your ideas. And as long as try to disentangle that ego thing, because if you have self-deceived yourself and thinking so you have some great idea, but it's really because you need to have a great idea rather than what it is, you have to bring the critical version of whoever would rip you to shreds. That's why, by the way, you'll hear me talk all the time about the problem of psychology. Okay? Like I then really went in. It's like, well, okay, maybe my ideas are totally crap. And then I got to a place where I was like, actually, I can justify this on the absolute rock solid ground. There's a thing called the problem of psychology. And that's been around forever. It's a central problem. And I think I solved that damn problem. And no one can tell me otherwise. I've gone around to a lot of people. Everyone agrees there's a problem. And what happened was the institution just decided, well, eclectic empiricism, that's what psychology needs to fucking be. And it's like, well, okay, you can decide that, but you didn't solve the goddamn problem, right? Okay. And so, you went that other path. So everyone can ignore me or whatever, but I know from an analytic position, I can define what that problem is. I can solve that problem. I can give that solution, share it with people. And that's very grounding at that level.
So
Gotcha. I think that's great. I mean, one of the things I like to tell people is ideas are like worthless, right? We venerate ideas, to your point, right? Because we see in history the great ideas and what they've actually done. But a billion people already had that idea long before that person who finally made it work or something.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. No. There's and that's the thing. It's about being, and a lot of meditation and wisdom. It's like be grounded in the being that you are. And fantasizing about what other people have been and trying to replicate that and being the next Einstein or whatever. I mean, that is going to be a path that's going to end you up in the clinic's office. I know. I've been there myself, and I've been on the other side of the couch. Yeah. So.
Oh well. I hope if I end up there, it's in your office. But thank you for that answer.
So, what is the problem of psychology is one of the questions on my list, but we've been going for 90 minutes. There's so much more we could talk about. I'd love to have you back again. This has been just fantastic. I feel like
I'm happy to. I'm happy to answer that question if you like, and I'm happy to come back. It's a lot of fun.
Well, I'd like to have you. I'd like to have you back for. There's a few more questions, but one question I'd like to end on, if we could, is something I want to pick up on something you said to Solid. You had said that way back when you weren't a good reader, and which I presume entails that you're now a good reader. What I think people could really benefit from this. What made you not a good reader, and what makes you a good reader now, and what could we do to become better readers?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the number of people, and probably especially males, who have some sort of a quirky learning style that doesn't conform to the goddamn sick school system, and then makes you feel kind of bitter and outsider, but you're a creative son of a bitch, and then you have this mixed feeling that you don't perform well in school. My oldest brother's valedictorian, gets all A's. I get tracked in the low reading thing, and my dad, who's the history professor, is like, well, we'll see if Gregg actually gets to college, that kind of deal. And it's like, well, actually, it turns out there's a reasonable potential here, but it just needed some time and some opportunity. But so essentially, I switched my B's and D's, so I had a little bit of dyslexia. I found writing awkward, and then what so often happens is that I always was pretty proficient verbally. I could always engage in a quick conversation. I'm fast in my verbal processing. I am fluid. I've always been that way. But I was not a good reader, and then I wouldn't pay attention. Okay? And then I wouldn't do my homework, and then I wouldn't learn things, and then it would be more annoying and more frustrating. So it's a classic, vicious cycle. I had enough intellectual capacity and enough achievement motivation, was in an educational system, and I knew I wanted to move on, so that I, worked myself so that I could get good enough to go to James Madison, where the school that I'm currently in, and do decent. Interest is so important. Okay, so in other words, intrinsic interest. All right, so intrinsic interest. So if you want to be a good reader, all right, the worst thing you probably can do is be at a place where somebody tells you have to get this for an external motivation, like a grade or a check mark, and it's something you don't give a shit about. All right, that's a nightmare. All right, so one thing is try to get into things that you actually care about, and then allow yourself to read. Another thing in relationship to that is recognize that you have that intelligence. Although it's an interesting concept and there is a G factor, it's also unbelievably varied. Okay, we like to think, oh, how smart are you? All right, I know for myself, I was like, God, when I'm talking to some people, I'm feeling really smart, and then when I sit down and read, I feel like an idiot. Okay, and then I was like, well, I don't like feeling like an idiot, so screw that. It's like, that's not the right frame of mind. Okay, you want what's called a growth mindset, which is, hey, this is challenging, but I can stick to it. I can get anti-fragile and resilient. I can work through it. That's much better than, oh, wow, I feel much more competent over here, so I'll keep doing this. And I feel little competent over here, so I never do that. Well, if it's an important capacity like reading, that's going to hurt you, definitely. Although nowadays, thankfully, we have so much that's much more verbal interactive. We're in better shape. And so I got interested in undergrad. and then started to read on my own with passion, and then I learned more, and so that was helpful. And then as I learned more and more, then I started to write. I was a crappy writer, but I then learned late in undergrad and then early in grad school how to write like I talked. Okay, so I would actually then read out every sentence that I would write, and then learn how to write like I talk. And the combination of learning how to write like I talk and then reading a lot, and then you build your fund of knowledge, and I'm actually am like a sponge. And when I start to learn something, I suck it up. And then when you have categories for learning things, like right now, my speed, I can just read something really fast, put it away, know exactly, oh, it's hard problem, consciousness, blah, 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 boom. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that because I have a lot of fund of knowledge, at least in the areas of expertise, and I can suck it up and then put it in and have a frame of reference. And then I can go back to Jung and actually now try to read Red Book and see what the hell he was trying to get at. Whereas before I didn't have that background or the reading fluency to accomplish that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. There's so much more to talk about. Your series with John is ongoing, so there will continue to be so much to talk about.
We don't know exactly how long. 20 sessions I think is what we sort of outlined. And actually we keep uncovering things. I will nudge John to come back to motivation and emotion, so you guys can say, hey, Gregg does believe that those things are important, and maybe our complementary perspectives will round out that holistic. So we'll see.
That's awesome. So we definitely want to have you back as soon as you're able. So we will. I'll follow up with you for that. Thank you again so much. This has been great, and thank you everyone for the great questions and for being here. This has been.
Does John come on this thing regularly?
Yeah, John comes on. Oh, there's my youngest just saying hi there for a second. Yeah, John comes on once a month here in the Discord for a Q&A. So he's been
send me a note when he's
fantastic.
coming. I'll come and I'll heckle him from the crowd.
Oh, I definitely will. And so it's the last Monday of the month. But
come once a month for a Q&A.
Okay, thanks, kiddo. But I'll definitely give you a heads up, and I'll send you a link to our calendar as well, so you can see all the events that we have, and everybody should check out our calendar. We have a Google Calendar pinned in the announcements channel, and our YouTube channel. This will go up on YouTube, so do all our other Q&As and other interesting stuff. I'm a bit behind in uploading, but I'll be making up for that in the next few days.
Okay.
But again, thank you so much. This has been amazing, and I really appreciate you being here.
Happy to be here. Love the questions. Thanks, everybody. I mean, these are, from my vantage point, right, we can make a society with kind of connection and validation and discussion and dialogos and all that good stuff. It's a hell of a lot better than the damn politics systems out there. So let's do it, people.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, you guys take care.
Thanks so much.
All right, man.
Have a great night. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.